Hello and welcome to the programme. So July the 17th marks the 5th anniversary of the Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17, which was shot out of the sky over territory held by Russian-led militants in eastern Ukraine. All 298 passengers on board the plane were killed. The Dutch-led joint investigation team announced last month the 4 names of those who played a key role in the downing. It was 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian at least. The international community has called on Moscow to hold those responsible to justice. Now, to talk more about the ongoing investigation process, we're joined in the studio today by Nadia Volkova, a director at the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. Hello, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
How important does jurisdiction, what sort of role does that play in this MH17 investigation when you have Ukrainian courts, perhaps, the Dutch courts, and also more international courts as well overseeing this? Right.
I think it's very important, but from the point of view whereby it should be decided which jurisdiction would have primary role. I think generally the question of jurisdiction and in terms of responsibility would also matter, because it's the same as we have with the conflict in Ukraine, you know, whether it's an international conflict or parallel to non-international conflict or just purely international conflict as far as Donbas region is concerned. So I think the same question will be raised in this court, because from what I know, there's a bit of a dilemma whether obviously they are Russian citizens and Russian supported Ukrainians who are involved or were involved as main suspects. But then at the same time, the downing took place over Ukrainian territory, and that fact cannot be ignored either. So it's the matter of balance, you know, where it's fully, whether it's a fully Russia responsibility of the Russian Federation, or also there is responsibility of Ukraine. But I don't think that the question of jurisdiction would come from the side of the victims, because I think they're pretty clear when it was decided that the court would be the hearing or the trial would be held in The Hague. That was a consensus. Therefore, I don't think it would play such an important role.
And also, I mean, you know a lot more than I do about this, but I'm sure that both countries are responsible for different things. So, for example, in a lot of foreign press, especially in Australia and Malaysia, some argue that Ukraine was responsible at that time for the airspace it was controlling. But at the same time, Ukraine probably didn't know that the Russian-led forces were holding such advanced weaponry that was capable of hitting a civilian airliner that was 37,000 feet around that in the air.
I think it's the question for the court as well.
So how does the court deal with that in a way?
I think it's going to be a matter of evidence. If Ukraine manages to show or demonstrate to the court that they really didn't know that, you know, civilian airplanes would be flying over its territory, or the separatists would be using the kind of weapon capable of shooting down any kind of airplanes, then it's one thing. Maybe then Ukraine would be able to relieve itself from the responsibility.
But it must be quite difficult, though, as a lawyer or as a state, to try and prove that you didn't know something. Is that right?
It's always very difficult, but that's why the case is so complicated, and everything about conflict in Ukraine is complex. It's just that, you know, with this case, I think is going to be the first case that's really a real one, that's going to be heard at the international level pretty much. And that's when the most important questions of general nature pertaining to the conflict will be decided. So I think it's important that Ukraine puts every ounce of its capabilities,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
to prove or to give as much evidence as possible.
Well, I would think, and I can't speak for them, but I would think that many of the victims' families already know that Russia will refuse to extradite the
Sure.
3 Russians suspected of this to the Netherlands. In fact, there's a law in place that says you can't. I believe Ukraine has the same thing. Is that right? They ban the extradition of citizens. I'm not sure.
No, I think there is an extradition law,
Yeah.
but obviously, like every law in Ukraine,
Yeah.
it has its limitations.
But so really, what I'm trying to say is that the court case is often used not to prove that these people were guilty, but really to put the facts on the table and use sort of all this evidence to really give some comfort to the victims' families.
It depends. I think you know, every national legal system is different to a certain degree from the international, you know, legal order, and that's why it's so important to have this synergy of national jurisdictions or national legal systems with the international ones, so there's no huge disparity when situations like, I mean, unfortunately, but they do arise in this world, and you know, there should be some instruments to deal with them. So that's why it's important to actually, for the systems to be synergized.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, and it's a sad heritage from the USSR, the legal system is so much different from the international approaches that it's very difficult to, when you're building a strategy, a case strategy, especially in complex cases like this, it's almost impossible to adopt the same kind of vision or understanding that, for example, in international trials like this, of this nature, would demand. So that's my biggest worry at the moment. I'm sure that if Ukraine could work up to the international standards, perhaps the evidence is there, you know, and it could very well
and has it been working as well? Because, I mean, you have perhaps this aspect of the MH17 trial, which is taking place in The Hague, at the sort of, you could say, the more local level in the Netherlands, but also you have Ukraine versus Russia, and Ukraine has accused Russia of financing terrorism. There's this case as well. Yeah. So how do those two cases intertwine? How do they come together? Do they conflict or not?
It's a very good question, because again, this trial at The Hague, the MH17 trial, would answer that question probably quicker than the ICJ.
Because this is a more broader thing.
It's broader, but at the same time, if for instance, it will be proven that, or shown that the MH17 flight was shot down in the course of the conflict and it was a war crime committed, then it would be in direct conflict with the position that Ukrainian side put forward in the ICJ case, because there it argues that, I mean, granted that, you know, the two could exist in parallel, but with this kind of crime, or, I mean, it's very difficult to kind of show that it's both, because for terrorism you need an intent, and if there is no intent, then, you know, it's
So that's difficult to prove then, that there is an intent, or not really?
I mean, yes.
In terms of sort of this sort of Russia's war in Ukraine.
I think it's the key element that needs to be proven at the ICJ case, and it's one of the most and almost impossible things to prove when there is an ongoing armed conflict as well.
Yeah, because it hasn't finished. I mean, this is the other thing.
It hasn't finished, and it was ongoing at the time. So here we go. Yeah,
I mean, I read something quite interesting. I mean, is it possible that any court could convict these 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian if they are guilty? That's quite important to stress. That the fact that they bought in and set up this Buk missile launcher and potentially had the idea to shoot down a plane, not necessarily MH17, would that be enough grounds in the legal sense to actually convict them of anything?
Sure. I mean, most likely, like I said, from my position, and it's a very subjective position as well, it would most likely be considered as a war crime rather than an act of terrorism, because, like I said, for the act of terrorism, there is to be an intent to scare, to instill terror, and so on and so forth. So, and if this is the version that I've heard as well, basically that the reason why they brought Book and there was an order to shoot down any plane flying over, because they were expecting Ukrainian planes to fly over, but they were expecting Ukrainian military planes to fly over, and then there had been a warning to Ukrainian side, if there is something, then we will be shooting.
So would that be a war crime as well, or would that fall under terrorism, or perhaps something else?
I mean, no. If we're talking about MH17, yes, that would be most likely would be considered as war crime. But if it was just a military plane, say,
well, if they thought it was a military plane, for example,
it wouldn't matter in this case.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, but if it weren't, the civilian airplane, it would be just and it took place in the course of the armed conflict, then it would just be a part of military operation.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of the Ukrainian who's suspected of being involved in this MH17 case, if there was a possibility of a video link or some form of communication with him, I mean, could he potentially be tried in Ukraine?
In theory, yes, he could.
Because he's a Ukrainian citizen. This happened on Ukrainian territory, officially. It's a tragedy.
Yes, but if I were a judge or GIT, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah?
Because I don't think it would be a trial in accordance with the necessary standards.
Yeah, because it also has to be a fair trial as well. And what does that mean, in a way? I mean, to have a fair trial, do the suspects have to be in the courtroom? Some people argue this is right, some people argue this is wrong. What's your view on this?
Yeah, as long as, a fair trial is something that has been adjudicated by the European Court of Human Rights. In many, many cases, it's one of the main articles of the European Convention of Human Rights. And obviously, there should be equality of sides, transparency, access to lawyer, all these things, basically. But it's not really the issue here. The issue here would be the ability of Ukrainian legal system to ensure a trial in accordance with all the standards.
Yeah.
Not just fair trial, but also quality of evidence, quality of judgments, all these things.
And I know you're not involved in the sort of political side of this, and I'm sure you've read this, though, about the Malaysian Prime Minister, who said that effectively we shouldn't jump to conclusions that Russia's guilty, despite all the evidence that's out there. So my question is, if without having direct proof that someone might have fired that, could the Russian state be guilty, or do they have to target individuals, or both even?
I think that both, because the Russian state, there is a case at the European Court of Human Rights, and it's against Russian state. But obviously, if Russian individuals are found guilty, then it goes to also show that Russian state was involved, because they would be considered as Russian agents.
Which is probably why Russia's blocking these United Nations Security Council resolutions.
Sure, and also because they don't want to cooperate in these things. They're not interested.
Okay, perfect. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming into our studio, and it's been great talking to you. Thanks very much. That was Nadia Volkova, Director at the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. Thanks for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more here on UATV.